Greetings and welcome to our online conversation series, Engaged, Religion and the Common Good. I'm Mahan Mirza, Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Today is the second day of Ramadan, the year 1441 of the Hijrah, also April 25th, 2020. We are extremely pleased, delighted to have with us today Mary McAleese. She served as the President of Ireland from 1997 to 2011. President McAleese is a scholar with a doctorate in canon law, and we're just elated to have her join us today, and also to have joined Ansari as the founding chair of our advisory board. So welcome, Mary.
Thanks very much indeed, Mahan, and to all who will eventually listen to us and to our conversation. Hello, everybody.
Yes, I hope there will be many who will tune in to benefit from this. Now, let me just start off by asking you about your presidency, and you're the first president who was born and raised in Northern Ireland. The theme of your presidency, a lot happened under your tenure, and the theme of your presidency came to be known as building bridges. So could you elaborate on how that came to be?
Well, there is a direct link between the fact that I'm the first president from Northern Ireland and the theme building bridges. Ireland, as most people probably will know, is partitioned. It was partitioned way back in the 1920s, divided not exactly into two equal parts, but one small part which remained with Britain, Northern Ireland. And the rest of Ireland then became an independent state, independent of Britain, which it had been colonized by for centuries, rather unhappily. So we ended up with a partitioned island. And one of the ways in which that partition was defined was by religion. The southern part of Ireland was and remains a largely Catholic phenomenon. The vast majority of people who live there are Catholic by denomination, Roman Catholic by denomination. In the north of Ireland, that part that remained part of Britain, initially at partition, it was dominated 66% by Protestants. So the Catholics were a very small minority. Over the years, that minority, instead of being fully integrated into government and work, were discriminated against, regrettably, by the Protestant government. That's the part that I grew up in. So I grew up as a Catholic in Northern Ireland, where my youth, particularly during my teens, we had the growth of a civil rights movement, rather like the civil rights movement in the United States at the same time. And it was civil rights for Catholics. Who were excluded from voting, who were excluded from jobs, excluded from housing, excluded from government. And that was my hinterland. I grew up with that. Regrettably, at that time, the unionist, what we call a unionist, that is the Protestant government of Northern Ireland, known as a unionist government because it favoured the union with Britain, it reacted really rather unintelligently to what were realistic demands for civil rights. And that eventually morphed into a really serious civil conflict, a hugely violent conflict, regrettably, that broke down along sectarian lines, Catholic against Protestant, Unionist against Irish nationalist, British Unionist against Irish nationalist. And I grew up in that hinterland. That war broke out on my doorstep when I was just about to go to university, to law school, as it happened. One of the things that I saw on the very day that I went to celebrate getting into law school was members of our then police force, an auxiliary police force, which was virtually 100% Protestant, attacking Catholic homes in my area and setting fire to them. To watch that, to watch men in uniform backed by government do that, put you in a very difficult dilemma. And the dilemma for me and for many young people then was, what path do you choose to respond to this? And I was very fortunate that the great hero of my life is a man called Daniel O'Connell, the Liberator. Anybody who's ever been to Dublin will know that the main street is called O'Connell Street. It's named after Dan O'Connell. He lived in, he died in the middle of the 19th century. having achieved Catholic emancipation from the then British government, having been a great champion of black slaves in America, of American African slaves, a great champion of Russian Jews, long before his time. And before the time came for a recognition of human rights and democracy, he was the champion of human rights and democracy. But as a young fellow of my age, when I saw the war break out on my doorstep, he was in France for the breakout of the revolution in 1789. And it frightened him. He saw how uncontrollable it was. Once that violent genie was out of the bottle, it was very hard to hold it back. And that made him, for life, an opponent of the use of violence to achieve political aims, no matter how provoked. And that was the hinterland that I grew up with. I grew up in a home where he was hero worshipped, and I grew up hero worshipping him. But from the time I was a teenager, right the way through to going to university and qualifying as a lawyer and becoming an academic lawyer, unfortunately, all during that time, we lived with what was effectively a civil war between neighbours in Northern Ireland. And the area I lived in was a particular locus. It was an area with 70% unemployment, very poor area. And I lived, funnily enough, even though I was Catholic, we lived always in the Protestant side of it. We were very fortunate that we had a monastery with about 40 priests in it. Imagine in those days, you just would not see that today, but 40 priests who held things together as much as they could. But the place disintegrated into rampant sectarian violence, so much so that it became the place. It's known as Ardoyne. I only ever called Ardoyne, but it has acquired the title the Ardoyne, as if it's some kind of a place apart, and maybe it is in some ways. But it became the place most associated with sectarian tit-for-tat killings. It has the highest density of sectarian killings. This is Catholics killing Protestants, Protestants killing Catholics. That happened every day on our doorstep, including, unfortunately, on the morning of my wedding. On the morning that my husband and I were married, two of the people that I loved and adored most in the world, I grew up next door to them. I'm the oldest of 9 children, and they were part of a family of 13, the O'Reillys. And we lived a few doors from each other on a stretch of road that was more or less Protestant, apart from a handful of Catholic homes, just at the back of the Catholic monastery. And the 2 boys, Tony and Miles, were slightly older than me, and they were the things that I had always wanted, older brothers. And I didn't have older brothers. I had 5 younger brothers and 3 younger sisters who were mostly a torment to me in those days, but they were the balm in my life. They were my support. But anyway, on the morning of my wedding, loyalists, that is to say, Protestant paramilitaries, shot them and burnt them to death. So you can imagine, it was a wedding that, with a great cloud of sadness that hung over it when the word came to us of what had happened to them. So yeah, I lived with that. I worked through all that. I made a very strong choice, as did my husband, from very early on. My husband and I are together 50 years this year, 50 years actually last year. We met and started going out together in 1969 as the Troubles broke out. And we both had the same perspective. We were hostile to conflict. We believed passionately in the gospel of the capacity of the human person to love, to forgive, to embrace one another, even across the worst of divides. And we hoped in that. As much as we believed in it, we hoped in it. And we could see evidence all around us of the failure of Christianity, or the failure of Christians to enable Christianity to fully flourish in their lives. So we made that our business. On our honeymoon, the day after Tony and Miles were murdered, we went to Kerry, and we visited the home and spent our day there, our first honeymoon day, in the home of Daniel O'Connell. So it was a kind of pilgrimage, if you like, a statement of intent Now, we were just in our 20s then, starting off in our careers. I had no idea that I would end up as President of Ireland, but we committed ourselves to working for, in every way that we could, across the ecumenical divide. So I became strongly associated with anything ecumenical that was going. We had interchurch talks. The two sets of churches, the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, commissioned me and a Quaker colleague to set up an working party on sectarianism, to look at ways in which the churches were contributing to the ongoing sectarianism and ways in which they could help to mend and to heal it. So we did that. And we, with a group of like-minded Catholics, Protestants, atheists and Jews, and we had no Muslims on that, regrettably, in those days. But we had a group of very good people from all sides of the community worked on that to give us a kind of a template or a navigational way out of the mess. But part of that navigational way involved critiquing ourselves and accepting that each one of us had a responsibility for the mess that we were in, and a responsibility for cleaning up that mess, because we were so good at pointing the finger at the other always, you know. The other was always to blame. We were not to blame. We were always the victims. And so we had to extricate ourselves from that victim consciousness to fully embrace the otherness of the other, because we come from very, very tribal systems, and a very tribal system, which is, if you like, it's not only tribal, but the tribalism is also defined by religion. And both sets of religions are highly politicized. So there's a lot of potential for toxicity in there, you know, in the relationships. And they are also both very strongly evangelical, very strongly proselytizing in their nature. If I give you an example, one of the best prime ministers we had in Northern Ireland during the beginning of the Troubles in the 1960s was a man called Terence O'Neill. He was a Protestant unionist. He belonged to a number of very strong anti-Catholic organizations, but he could see that we really needed to create a community that was no longer divided by the politics of religion. And so he wanted to concede equality to Catholics. Well, that resulted, of course, in him being essentially being lost to politics, because he lost out his own constituents. He did not back him, but he was the best of them. And yet, one of the things that he said that really rankled with Catholics was, he said to his constituency, you know, to the Protestants, look, if you treat Catholics well, they'll start to behave like Protestants. Now, that's, you can't really work towards equality, full, honest, open, embracing equality, if your agenda is to turn the other into you, is to convert.
It's another
and
way
we both had these cultures of conversion, both of us. The Catholic Church very strong in a culture of conversion also. So, so that didn't help. And I decided that in everything I did, I would try and be a person who embraced the other. I say I was very fortunate. I grew up in a Protestant area, so I knew all my friends were Protestant. I knew all the churches they went to and the churches they didn't go to. I grew up with their politics, they grew up with mine, and I was very happy that I did not grow up in a ghettoized environment, because I don't think that was healthy, and I don't think it is healthy. 93% of all people in Northern Ireland live in areas that are defined by one religion, just one religion. So they're either Catholic areas or Protestant areas. They're essentially ghettoized. I don't think that's healthy. So when the opportunity came to run as President of Ireland, now not of Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland doesn't have a president. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so the head of state there is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. But I had moved, my husband and I had moved to live in Dublin, the capital of the Republic of Ireland. And we worked there for many years. I worked both as an academic in Trinity College in Dublin, and I also worked as a current affairs journalist for the national radio and television station. And so, and my father, of course, was from where I now live in the west of Ireland, in the Republic, in the county of Roscommon. So that hinterland was already part of my life. I wasn't a Belfast girl in the very conventional sense that many others were. I had very strong roots in the Republic. And we lived here for a long time, then we both returned to live in Northern Ireland with our children in and around 1987. Having lived in the Republic, I'd lived here since 75. But of course, the conflict was still ongoing. We were now into thousands of dead, day by day by day, bombs, killings, murders, streets you couldn't walk, young people out, playing on a street, drive-by shootings, Catholics of Protestants, Protestants of Catholics, an appalling scenario, really. And the British Army in the middle of it, not loved, may I say, by the Catholic population at all. So when we moved back to live in Northern Ireland, I became head of an institute, a postgraduate institute for lawyers, for law students in the Queen's University of Belfast. And then I subsequently became the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Queen's, the first woman Pro-Vice Chancellor of Queen's. It was while I was in that job in 1997 that the opportunity to consider becoming the President of Ireland became, it sort of revealed itself when Mary Robinson, who was my predecessor in the job, decided she was not going to go for a second term. Under the Irish Constitution, which is a written constitution, as in the United States, the President serves for 7 years. Serves in a space above politics, is not like the American president, it's not an executive role, has certain executive functions, but very limited. We have a prime minister whom we call a Taoiseach, for example. He is essentially the executive officer. The president is the guardian of the Constitution, operates in a kind of a moral space, what I would call a pastoral space, above politics. And so I ran in that election where I didn't have a vote because I was living in Northern Ireland at the time. And I ran in that election because under the Constitution, anybody born on the island of Ireland has a right to stand for election as president. So I did, and I won. And I made the theme of my presidency building bridges. And I think that appealed greatly to people because they knew I knew Northern Ireland well. They knew that I also knew the Republic well, that I understood the religious components of both well, and so that I should be a reasonably sure pair of hands and a good heart, if you like, to help at a time when we did not then have what we have now, which is a thing called the Good Friday Agreement. This is an agreement that was come to by all the parties with the help, may I say, of Senator George Mitchell, the envoy of President Clinton, who helped to bring all the parties who over their dead bodies would speak to each other. Eventually, there were so many dead bodies that they felt they had to talk. And it was George Mitchell and people like Tony Blair and our own Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, who managed to get them all together to agree a compromise that we now call the international treaty known as the Good Friday Agreement. I came into office 6 months before that agreement. And my job when I came into office was to try and get in behind the huge groundwell of support that I knew was there on both sides for peace, but didn't really have a voice until the peace process began to give it that voice. So we got the agreement. It went to a referendum about 6 months after I was elected, and a referendum in Northern Ireland and a referendum in the Republic of Ireland. And that referendum was so important because although we had the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, which was agreed by politicians, it was always very important that it was going to be backed by the people, and it was. It was. Those 2 referenda showed that virtually right across the boards, regardless of religion, regardless of politics, everybody wanted to back that treaty, more or less everybody. There were always the few who were a little bit slower, who, like Doubting Thomas, had to be led subsequently, had to show that it would work. So that was my work. My work after that was designed to build the bridges between the peoples of Northern Ireland, Catholic and Protestant, from whom I came, between North and South, where I had lived, and again, where relationships were not good. Relationships between North and South were not good. For example, the trade border in the European Union with the least commerce across it was the one on the island of Ireland. And no economics could possibly explain that, but history and prejudice and fear and distrust, that explains it. And we also had to address the other big set of relationships, which was between Ireland and Great Britain, between London, if you like, Westminster and Dublin, which had improved over the years since we both became members of the European Union, had disimproved under Margaret Thatcher's rule terribly. We were very, very damaged during her time. But during the time of John Major, improved quite dramatically, and he and our Taoiseach Albert Reynolds got on famously together. Then the huge improvement that came with Tony Blair and our Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and the interest, the enormous interest from the then American government. That all, if you like, conspired to get the heft that we needed to get the peace on the road. And my job was to help all those three sets of relationships the best I could. So building bridges became the work that we did day in and day out. So that my house, it wasn't mine, it's the house of the Irish people. It's called Arison Oak. They're on the House of the President, located right in the heart of Dublin. It became a place of hospitality. Just that now, friendship building. We weren't trying to proselytize, we weren't trying to evangelize. I wasn't trying to turn anybody into a believer in a united Ireland. I wasn't trying to turn anybody into a Catholic. God forbid all of those things. We were trying to set the scene for people who had different politics, who had different religions, to really understand that we could all, despite all those differences, be the best of neighbors. And if we could be the best of neighbors, we would learn to live happily with each other's differences and work out the consequences of those through politics and dialogue and friendship and in friendship. So that's what we did for 14 years. We had tea and buns and dinners and lunches and visits, and we invited literally tens and hundreds of thousands of people to that house. And we concentrated on people who over their dead bodies would ever come to the house of the Irish president. People from the unionist background, Protestant background in the north, loyalist paramilitaries. These were Protestant unionist paramilitaries who would have no time for the south of Ireland, and certainly none for the Irish president. So that's what we concentrated on. And at the end of 14 years, going in through the door of that house on the first day of the 11th of November, 1997, I said to my husband, when I thought I only had 7 years in front of me, but in fact I served for 2 full terms, I said, we'll know in 7 years' time if the commandment to love one another really works, because that's what we're going to do. And on the day we left, as we walked through the door, I said to my husband, I think it works. Mm-hmm. And that was our feeling, that over the 14 years, we were able to accomplish a lot in terms simply of friendship building. I guess the best evidence of that is that for most of that time, it would have been absolutely unthinkable for Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, to visit the Republic of Ireland on a state visit. She had never set foot in the Republic of Ireland in her life. We had not had, in the Republic of Ireland, there had never been a state visit by a British monarch. The last monarch to stand in the Republic of Ireland had been in 1911, when it was still part of the British Empire. So, and of course we'd had a war, we'd had a rebellion and a war designed to get rid of the British from Ireland. A successful, partly successful, if you count partition as part success. And there are those, the good thing about the Good Friday Agreement is now that everybody agrees that Northern Ireland shall remain part of the United Kingdom. Unless the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise, and it's left to that. It will be decided by the people, not by war, not by shooting, not by bombing. How anybody ever thought that they could bomb Protestant unionists into believing in a united Ireland has always mystified me. But I think we're well past those arguments. Paramilitarism as a culture is dying now. And so over the 14 years, my job was to make that culture of paramilitarism, help those who are trying to make it go away, and to replace it with a culture of good neighbourliness. And so we invited Her Majesty the Queen in May of 2011, shortly before I left office. We felt that we were on solid enough ground. Not everybody felt we were on solid ground, but I was sure we were. And we invited Her Majesty. She came and she spent 4 days with us. And to say that they were like a balm to the heart and soul would really be no exaggeration. She came not just as the visitor from next door. She came on a mission of reconciliation. She and I had spoken about this mission of reconciliation long before I ever became president. 2 years before I became president, I had met her in her home, and we had talked about this, the great need for this form of reconciliation. So on every occasion that I had met her since, and in particular as president, we had talked about it, and it came about. And we had 4 days, and I'll just end up by saying this. There were a lot of people who were skeptical about having her at all, because there is a history of, the British were not kind to Ireland. It's as simple as that. We have to be honest about it, and she was honest about it. As she said, there were things that happened that should never have happened. So, and it was a long history, and it was a miserable history. So there were people who were still angry about that, and probably rightly so. But then there were other people who thought, well, we can't have her because she'll be a security risk, and God bless us, if anything was to happen to her in Ireland, how would we ever cope with that? So that was a legitimate also worry. But again, I wasn't worried. I knew that we could take good care of her, and I knew that she trusted us to do that. Even though there were people who would be mischievous enough to try to interrupt the visit, as a very tiny, tiny number did, but they were irrelevant. And so she came, and at the end of 4 extraordinary days, and that's all I can describe them as. I mean, people cried for 4 days, as so much pent up angst, but also that yesness in people came out. That willingness to embrace the otherness of the other came out. And after she left, 4 days later, I got a letter from an elderly lady who said to me that she did not want the Queen to come to Ireland, that she was an old Irish Republican, and she resented the British greatly. And she thought that I had made a dreadful error in bringing the Queen to Ireland. But, she said, I decided to watch the first 5 minutes of the visit. And the Queen touched down, her flight touched down at an airport that is called after one of Ireland's great heroes, who was assassinated by the British, hanged by the British, Sir Roger Casement. And the plane touched down there, and the very fact that she touched down at Sir Roger Casement Aerodrome itself says something really very powerful. And then she emerged wearing a beautiful green outfit, and our colour, of course, is green for Ireland, the Emerald Isle. And so this lady then said she watched that, and for the next 4 days, she didn't turn the television off. She said, in fact, it nearly spontaneously combusted. She had it on so much. But she said that when the Queen's flight took off from Cork Airport on the day she left, she felt that the entire visit had been, in her words, choreographed by the angels. Now, I could not have found a phrase better.
Wow.
to explain what we had undergone in those 4 days, the friendship building, the forgiving and forgetting, the decision that the past was in the past, but now we were engaged in future building. And what we were not going to do was we were not going to continue to ransack the past for the spores of toxic fragmentation and dissension that we were going to keep throwing into the future, so that every future generation was infected by those past toxins. It was a watershed, you know, it was a new moment. And we were saying the past is in the past, let us leave it there. and let's try and move forward as friends. And I think that it was a huge, if you like, 900-year air clearing.
Wow.
So that's what bridge building was all about for those 14 years.
Well, thank you for such a moving and inspiring and detailed account of building bridges. And it's poetic that when you came in, this Good Friday agreement took place with the North, and as you went out, the angels choreographed a connection on the other side. And so you built both the bridges that that needed to be built in that time. There's so much here to discuss. One of the things is how sectarianism, can drive and fuel conflict, but at the same time, the answer to that is not an absence of religion, but ecumenism, introspection, a coming together, the commandment of neighborliness that you mentioned, and just a spirit of hospitality and just desire to see the human in each other, and to agree that despite other differences, that's something that is sacred in and of itself. And so it's a beautiful account. And I want to turn maybe to where angels need to choreograph these things in other parts of the world. Ironically or coincidentally, where the British have also been. So in my own home land of South Asia, we've got history with India and Pakistan. The British were there, and then at independence, the subcontinent was partitioned. And now we see bitter conflict, ongoing conflict between Pakistan and India, with flashpoints like Kashmir, and also within the countries with respect to their minorities. And most prominently now we hear about this with the Hindutva movement in India and all the tension that creates over there. Obviously, there's also Israel-Palestine. So I wonder if you can help us think through how bridges can be built in other parts of the world. And if you want to pick a case, you can pick either one of these. And maybe the big question is, in one sense, when you came to office, you were riding kind of a historical movement and a crescendo, right? And so
Yes.
that reached a crescendo, but it needed someone to be the pastoral president. And without which, if they got a different kind of president, you could see different kinds of outcomes. So I guess one question is, does history just bring the person up? Or does sometimes a person come in and move the history forward? There's an interesting dialectic between those two. And what do you think we need in order to bring some of these other places into reconciliation? And how do you see religion particularly playing a role in that reconciliation?
I think leadership is key. I think bad leadership, whether it's of politics or religion, or God forbid, both intricately interwoven, bad leadership leads to bad places and bad outcomes. Good leadership can help to guide and navigate to safe territory for everybody. And we had that experience, of course, in Northern Ireland. I mentioned earlier that we had a good Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill, in the 1960s, but he was a pragmatist, and I think he was a principled man also, and he was saying things that needed to be said if you were to try and create a community based on equality, justice, parity of esteem, where everybody, regardless of their politics or religion, was respected and had equal citizenship. At the same time, his very words, that kind of leadership, provoked an opposite and a very, very unequal reaction. And that came from a man called the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, who was a demagogue then. Now, he's an interesting case in point because he was a demagogue, utterly sectarian, bitterly anti-Catholic, bitterly anti-Irish in many ways. And he was able to feed the fear because Terence O'Neill was talking about equality with Catholics, or for Catholics, in an environment where people had been led to and bred to believe that they were always going to be superior. There was a lot of fear, and he didn't have the strength, the personal strength, I believe, to see it through, and he didn't have the movement behind him to see it through. Instead, that movement, the fear that he generated within his own people, was captured by a bitter, toxic, sectarian demagogue. That was the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, who fed Protestant paramilitarism, which in turn provoked Catholic paramilitarism, and suddenly we had a civil war on our hands because of really, really bad leadership. After that period, it was a long time again before we got a good leader at the top. We had people like John Hume, for example, but then John was never elected to office. If you were looking to Northern Ireland's political leaders, its governance, they were appalling, they were hopeless. They were still unable to break out of the hermetic seal conferred on them by history and life of being Protestant supremacists, essentially. They couldn't move beyond it. We had to have somebody who would move. And isn't it interesting that in the end, the man who ultimately delivered co-governance between the bitterest of enemies was the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley. After years and years and years of being, a bitter sectarian demagogue, he changed. Now, I could be quite cynical and say he changed because he saw an opportunity to become Prime Minister. And I actually don't care why. The reasoning doesn't bother me because I do believe the Lord does work in mysterious ways. But suddenly, this man who was demagogic and hostile in the extreme, would never come across the border, would never meet it, had nothing but bad things to say about the Irish government, called the Pope terrible names. Suddenly, he transformed into a statesman. And he became the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who ultimately helped deliver what we have now, which is co-governance between two factions which absolutely, resolutely had no time for each other and are just about squeaking along together now, but even that in itself is a miracle. And it's a miracle of leadership. And I think, you see, you've hit on something there that wasn't all that well noticed and tends to get forgotten, and it is the role of religion in these things. We can point to the sectarian nature of it, the toxic nature, the anti-Catholic, like anti-Islam, like anti-Semitism, but actually in back of that, there are people who are really good people, who are Jews, who are Muslims, who are Catholics, who are Protestants, who believe in human goodness and kindness, who do not want to treat the other with contempt, but want to treat the other with brotherly and sisterly love. And they're praying, and they are working, and they are going about their business every day also. And in each of our traditions, there is that impulse for love, for forgiveness. And honestly, I do believe, and it's never ever talked about in the context of our Northern Ireland peace process, and I think it should be, that all the people who gathered around that table, who created the Good Friday Agreement, they all came out of the Christian tradition. Some of them didn't think the others were Christian. Some of the Protestants didn't think the Catholics were. Some of the Catholics didn't think the Protestants were. But here's the thing. They had all grown up with the same Bible tradition. They had all grown up with the same words of Christ. They had all heard those words, love your neighbor as yourself, and to forgive. They had somewhere buried in them was that set of words, that set of impulses and principles. And honestly, I think it bubbled to the surface. And I think it bubbled to the surface with the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley too. And so he gave a new form of leadership to the constituency that he had once wanted to be virulently anti-Catholic and anti-equality and anti-Dublin. Suddenly, he was in my house and having breakfast with the President of Ireland and sharing prayers with me. And, and talking to our Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and giving him gifts, and Bertie giving him gifts. And do you know something? When people start to talk nicely to each other, even people who are utterly and profoundly different in terms of politics and religion, but when they simply talk nicely to each other and respectfully, they permit their vast constituencies who look to them for leadership to also start to talk respectfully. Northern Irish politics were never, ever characterized by respectful discourse, quite the opposite. They were always nasty, mean, horrid to each other. And that, of course, what happens when you hear someone say something nasty about your community, it keeps the wound open, you know, the wound doesn't get a chance to heal. It remains raw, particularly when the other is killing your people today and you're killing their people tomorrow, but you're only counting your own dead, you know? You're not really embracing the dead of the other to the same extent. So it seems to me that leadership is key and language is key. And one of the great gifts to Northern Ireland was the gift of Senator George Mitchell. You know, his background, Lebanese Christian background, you know, a great senator, American senator. And he spent years with Northern Irish politicians. And at the very beginning, of course, everybody wanted him on their side. And he was quite determined. He was not going to be on any one side. He was going to be literally the honest broker. He had to work hard to establish that, and eventually he did. But most importantly, no matter how provoked, and I'm telling you that man was provoked, he was provoked beyond anything that any human being should ever have had to listen to. He never, ever lost his temper. He never lost his cool. He never lost his serenity. He kept always this wonderful face that wasn't just a kind of a mask of diplomacy. It wasn't that. It was the voice of a man who believes that everybody already is equal. And he just wants everybody else to appreciate that. And when you live in a world where everybody is equal, here's how you talk to each other, and here's how you talk about each other. And honestly, he changed the language. And in changing the language, he changed the nature of the dialogue. And when the nature of the dialogue was changed, the outcome of the dialogue changed, and we got what we have now, which is a peace process. I'm not going to call it a stable or permanent peace. It's not that. It's built on, you know, it's built on people, and it's built on fragile history and human relationships, but it's a heck of a lot better than anything that I had growing up. The last 20 years in Northern Ireland have been much better than anything that has gone before, even allowing for occasional appalling instances of violence. But the paramilitary culture has virtually gone, virtually gone. Tiny, tiny fragments remain, and they will, unfortunately, I think, probably always remain, those tiny fragments. These are people who are irredentist, who cannot ever, ever be persuaded that the use of violence for political ends is anathema, and is never going to achieve the outcome that they intend, because the people that they are hurting are the people whom they're trying to convince to their political ends. So it's a zero-sum game. So I think leadership is key. And if you have good leadership, that is, you can have leaders who contribute toxins to already toxic environments, and they make them explosive. You can have people who can say, with a word or a sentence or a nuance, they can drive the other to a frenzy of indignation that can very well outcrop in resentment, frustration, violence, resistance. Or you can have a person who, with the most measured of words, can calm things, can make people think, well, maybe I should listen to that woman. Maybe I should listen to that man. Now, they're not from my tradition, they're not from my politics, but I think that's a worthy person to listen to, so that you get calm instead of storm. You get hope instead of complete dismay and distress. I think, for example, one of the great leaders of Europe in my time has been Angela Merkel, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, she's streets, head, shoulders above everybody else, basically, bar none. And I think of her impulse to generosity when 1 million migrants came to her country. And other people put up barbed wire and barricades and talked about, suddenly went into a strict nationalist mode, hermetically sealing countries and identities, and they didn't want that other to enter. But she looked at that other and she saw a human person who was suffering. She just saw people who were suffering. And she responded like the daughter of the man's that she is, the kid who had learnt from early childhood, these are my brothers. She'd learnt the Beatitudes. We visit people in prison. We outreach to the hungry. We help the oppressed. We don't turn away the stranger. She'd learnt the story of the Good Samaritan. We don't turn away the stranger who needs help. And I just thought, well, of course, she paid a huge political price because doing the right thing can sometimes be measured in the indignation that is visited upon it by those who oppose the doing of the right thing. And they are the people, unfortunately, who make your world, the world of Pakistan and India, really very, very difficult. The world of Palestine and Israel, very difficult. Because these are people who, with their words, stir up our deep sense of being other, and who do not say words that help us to believe we belong to one common human family. And in that common human family, we can be as other as we like, but we can still be beloved by each other, helped by each other, work together, run countries and governments together, be equal citizens.
But this is just so tremendously rich, and the richness, with all its breadth and examples, you also gave us very specific leadership and language. And when I think of, what we were speaking of earlier about the double religion as a double-edged sword, where it can breed this kind of toxicity and sectarianism, but then it also brings out the best of us that helps to reconcile. I suppose with the leaders, we need them to emerge from the camp that can reconcile, not getting rid of religion, but bringing forth the best of religion. And we're in Ramadan. Every night we do a portion of the Quran. Tonight's my turn, and I'm going to be talking about chapter 3 in the Quran. And there's a verse in there that is addressing the Prophet Muhammad. And it says, it's a very interesting verse for me, but I think it just captures leadership and language, where he's being told to say, or he's being told to him, it is by the mercy of God that you were lenient with your companions. If you had been harsh and hard-hearted, they would have scattered away from you. And so forgive them and seek forgiveness for them, and continue to include them in your councils of mutual consultation. And this verse, I'm reminded of this because he's a prophet, right? In the Muslim tradition, he's a prophet, and he's receiving revelation from God. And God is telling him, even though you have the truth straight from me, if you don't deliver it nicely, they're not going to listen.
Yes, well, that's a message that that is very pertinent. I'm a member of the Catholic Church, and within the Catholic Church, we have every conceivable kind of attitude, shall we say, or perspective. Some of which are really, very, very, very ultra-conservative, hostile, can be very nasty, very intimidating for those who are then regarded as liberals or a la carte Catholics, or who are made to feel that they are less Catholic somehow because they might, for example, critique aspects of doctrine. I myself have huge difficulty with some aspects of doctrine, but I have even more difficulty, much more difficulty with bad management, just pure bad management in the church. When we don't in my tradition, the Catholic Church tradition, because it is a centralized managerial system, we just have the most appalling management imaginable. So with bad management, you get bad outcomes. I mean, the whole clerical child sex abuse and the episcopal mismanagement is a classic example of that, but it's not the only example of what you get when you don't have people who are good managers. when you have people who are just inept managers. You also can get not just corruption, but you get, that somewhere between corruption and stupidity. You get that awful mix. So within my church, the Catholic Church, we have it's a huge, broad church with extremes of view on both sides, and a huge body of people in the middle who just bundle on, the people of God just doing their own thing, trying to live the gospel the best they can. But it's interesting. I grew up in a Protestant area, so I frequented, with my friends, virtually I've always been interested in churches, always been interested in religion from a very early childhood. And so when my friends were going to their churches, my Protestant friends, I would go with them. So much so that when one of my Protestant friends married a British soldier and my sister was her bridesmaid, which incidentally would normally have invited the Catholic paramilitaries to tar and feather us, because fraternizing with the British Army was, a sin in the eyes of the Provisional IRA, the Catholic paramilitary organization. But they were our friends, and they'd been always very good to us. There was no question of us, A, not going to the wedding, and B, not being my sister not being the bridesmaid. So we went to a military barracks where the wedding was held, and the minister was a man called the Reverend Sidney Callaghan, who used to minister on the Shankill Road, which is a tough, really tough working class loyalist paramilitary stronghold. And I lived at the top of that road for many years. And during the course of the ceremony, he said that while he knew the bride, obviously, and that many of the people who were in front of him were notionally members of his church, that it was ironic that the face that he knew best was mine, because I'd been so often in his church. Now, this is like 30 years before I became president of Ireland. That hinterland, I think, really enriched me. I went to gospel halls. I went to First Presbyterian, Second Presbyterian, Methodist, Church of Ireland, Anglican. And that really enriched my life. And then when I left office, in 2011, I went to Rome to study at the Pontifical Gregorian University to qualify as a canon lawyer. I'm already a civil lawyer, since I was in my 20s. So I wanted, and I've always been interested in canon law. And so I went and I qualified there as a canon lawyer, and then did a doctorate in canon law. Now, while I was there, I lived in a place called the Lay Centre, which is right behind the Colosseum, wonderful place. And many of the people who live there, they're all adults who are studying in pontifical universities. Quite a number of them were from other faith traditions, and they were studying with the help of what are called Nostra Aetate scholarships. These are scholarships given by the Catholic Church to scholars from other faith traditions to come and study Catholicism or Christianity. So I lived in this lay center where we were a group of, say, 25, with 2 imams, with a rabbi, with a dervish priest, with Orthodox. It was an extraordinary mix. And one of the best conversations I ever had was with a young imam from Kosovo, who became a great friend, who's an expert on the Virgin Mary. And until I met him, I did not know the role played by the mother of Jesus in the Islamic tradition. And I was blown away by that, completely blown away by that. And subsequently, I've become very lucky. One of my great and dear friends is a woman called Dr. Umar Al Cabeza. She became the first woman elected to an Arab in the Gulf states to Parliament. And she became the first speaker of a Parliament in the Gulf states. And I got to know her really by accident more than anything, and discovered, you know what, everything about her in terms of her religious sensibility, her understanding of her relationship with God, and what that means in terms of how it expresses itself in her relationships with other people. It could be me talking. When she speaks, I've nothing to say in contradiction. I just listen mesmerized and think, but we think the same thing. We are, and of course, we are part of the Abrahamic faith tradition, the one God tradition. And she speaks so respectfully of Jesus. And she just blew me away. And she came and she became the first woman, not just the first woman, but the first Islamic scholar to preach in Ireland from a Christian pulpit. When she preached in Waterford Cathedral in Waterford, at the invitation of the Dean of Waterford. And I think when you meet people of a deep faith that is not something, a faith that goes really deep because you want it to infuse you with a relationship with the Creator and with creation. When you meet those people, it really doesn't matter what denomination they belong to. You recognize in them that capacity for love, that capacity for generosity, that wonder and curiosity about God's creation. It's when you meet people who look at you and think, oh, hang on a minute, she's a Catholic. Or you meet someone who thinks, oh, he's a Muslim. Oh, I can't go talking to them. Or I'm going to be nervous about that person because he's Jewish or because he's agnostic or atheist. When you meet those people, you realize that this religion hangs over them. It's skin deep. It hasn't infused the soul in the way that when it does infuse the soul, you become a person rich with love, rich with generosity, rich with kindness. Now, that's not to say you mightn't have a bad day or an off day, when you're narky and snarky, fine. But your instinct is when you meet the Muslim who is not of your tradition, or the Jew who's not of your tradition, or the Catholic or the Protestant, what is enlivened in you is a curiosity about God's creation, a determination to make friends with this person and learn something from them. Not to proselytize them, not to evangelize them, not to convert them, and not, most above all, not to despise them for who they are. So that to me has, I look at those relationships that I've had through meeting people of a deep, deep religious sensibility, and they are fabulous. I think these are the people who will change the world. And one of the things, in fact, you and I have discussed this, I think I might have mentioned this to you before, is one of the things that bothers me greatly, and I think it's a foundational kind of idea at the heart of the Ansari Institute, is that 5 out of 7 people in the world identify as religious. 5 out of 7 people. That's a lot of people. That's billions. I belong to the Catholic Church, which has 1.2 billion people in the world. It's the biggest NGO in the world. And other big NGOs in the world are run by Muslims. And if we didn't have those people, where would the charitable outreach be? Where would the outreach to the poor be? In the developing world, where would the care be? Now, I know that certainly in the case of my own church, it came at a price. There's a dark side to all this, but there's also a good side to it, an impulse to goodness. We're all seeing it at the moment through the impulse to goodness that is inspired by the COVID-19 virus crisis, and people are coming out of the woodwork to be kind and decent and caring for one another and beggar religion. For many people, it is nonetheless, it is a religious, it's a spiritual impulse. It's an impulse from the divine that's in your heart and soul to reach out to the divine in the other and to express itself, because at the end of the day, we might be the work of God's hands, but in this world, we are the hands of his work. Mm-hmm. Without us doing that work, how does the love of God manifest itself? If we are narky, snarky, mean, contemptuous, and at the same time purport to be God-fearing people, what does that tell others who experience us as narky and snarky or contemptuous? What does that tell them about our God? So it seems to me that we have a real those of us who have a religious sensibility have a real responsibility in this world that we live in to draw attention to the fact that 5 out of 7 people in the world have a religious sensibility, that needs to be factored in our discussions, in terms of our political discussions, our civic discourse. The story I was going to say was Madeleine Albright in her memoir says that when she went into the State Department and got a briefing, a very thick and very erudite briefing on Iraq, from one end of it to the other, the word religion wasn't mentioned. No mention of religion. And then suddenly you had the religious revolution in Iraq, and everybody went, what the heck happened there then? Yeah. Because they hadn't intuited it. It's almost as if, oh, well, we won't talk about religion. It's privatized. Don't go there. It's not relevant. We have a media that very often is, in many ways, illiterate about religion, not terribly knowledgeable. And we also have people, including in my own church too, who are illiterate about their own religion. They've only just skated the surface. So there's a huge amount of work to be done there. in introducing religious discourse without looking like you're trying to proselytize or evangelize, but merely educate and merely push into public discourse issues to do with people who have a religious sensibility, to make that part and parcel of everyday discourse. Because until we do that, those people who are the 5 out of 7 also are allowed to privatize those thoughts and to live inside hermetic bubbles. It seems to me that's a very dangerous thing, where everybody lives inside their denominational bubble, convinced that they have a rightness and a righteousness that is superior to the people in the bubble next door, who identify themselves over and against other religions by being against those other religions. That we really need to encourage the dialogue and the discourse that breaks down barriers, that, to go back to the theme originally, that builds bridges to each other and does not erect hostile barricades.
With 5 out of 7, people being religious, and an increasing majority of people going to be identified as religious, whether they are practicing in their lives or to what extent they're devout is another question. But at least we know that a majority of the world and an increasing majority is going to be religious into the foreseeable future, and definitely in the 21st century and beyond. And so religion isn't talked about, it's invisible, like in the rooms of Madeleine Albright, but when it does come up in her room or in the newsrooms, it's always as this negative force, as a problem, as something that causes, that needs to be managed and contained. But in all the good that religion does, as you mentioned, it gets missed. And so I guess our responsibility is to try and see that good, articulate it, and help the world see it as well, and change the conversation about religion.
Exactly.
And at the same time, to be self-critical, as you mentioned before. And so there's an interesting dialectic between these two. Getting to know the other, reaching out and interacting with the other, and projecting the good of religion in the world that otherwise seems to be invisible. At the same time, seeing within, as you mentioned, the church, and we from within the Islamic tradition, so many things that need to be changed. And this brings me to, I was looking up before we got here, and I found the Encyclopedia Britannica article on you. And it calls you an unapologist nationalist Catholic with conservative views on abortion and divorce. And then it says, but also critical of the church hierarchy on a number of issues. And so how do we balance this tremendous love that we have for tradition and for religion and for our communities with the need to be self-critical?
Well, I belong to a tradition in the Catholic Church, or belong to the Catholic Church, which traditionally was very good at critiquing everything and everybody outside the church. It spoke from the great pulpit out to the world, the voice of moral authority, the high moral ground, but was always very poor at turning the spotlight back internally, and very hostile to internal critique. So that's, and I think that still remains the case. It is much better at critiquing the world at large than it is critiquing itself. So, and part of that is that self-protection, the idea that, well, if we start criticizing ourselves, all we're doing is, handing to our enemies the bricks to throw at us. Personally, I think we have to speak the truth no matter what. To go back to that Encyclopedia Britannica is a bit out of date now, I have to say, because I have changed my views on both those issues considerably since then. So that's also an important thing, that we have the capacity to change and to be changed and to be persuaded of change. And I think that's also a very, very important part of being human, the capacity to change and to be changed. Now, that can happen both ways. If we are persuaded by good leadership, fine, but we can also be persuaded by bad leadership. I think of the loyalist paramilitaries, for example, the Protestant paramilitaries, who, when they announced their ceasefire, one of them memorably said that he wished he had never heard of the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, because it was the words of that man that sent them out to hurt others, that gave them what they believed the language of justification for killing Catholics. And so it seems to me that what we really need within each of our traditions is, in the case of my tradition, the Catholic Church, is a healthy respect for people who are seeking the truth, both inside their church, but also outside in the world. And that includes a capacity for critiquing. Without critiquing, you don't get change. I mean, that's the other side of it. How do you change unless people are able to say that which you have been doing up to now isn't really working, doesn't have integrity, is past its sell-by date? You need to have the space for that. In the Catholic Church, we have very limited space, very, very limited space for that. No space at all, of course, for women to have a say whatsoever, and a very, very limited space for even for men, because although it is essentially a male-driven hierarchy, and it was an exclusively male hierarchy, the vast majority of men in the church will also have no real say, because those men who drive the church are cardinals, bishops, priests who are celibate, who have taken a vow of celibacy. So they are what 0.0000001% of the church, and they decide everything pretty much. Practices, protocols, doctrines, interpretations, teachings, and the rest of us are expected to obey. Now, that was okay. That kind of worked at a time when two things didn't exist in the world. First of all, mass education, mass second and third level education. When you were dealing with uneducated people and you had a hierarchical structure that was essentially the structure of empire, with the Pope as monarch or emperor, as he was indeed up until 1870. Then the second thing that structure didn't have embedded in it, though it did have a consciousness of human dignity, but what it didn't have was an articulated set of human rights, as we got with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here we are in the early years of the 21st century, and at our back, a new wind at our back has come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the massification of second and third level education. It has, for example, completely transformed Ireland. We didn't get second level education until the end of the 1960s. My parents, for example, left school at 14 and 15. My mother became a hairdresser, my father became a barman. And they had no chance of going. They came from poor homes. There wasn't the remotest chance of going on to college or staying on at school. It was not an option. My generation was the first generation to have the opportunity to stay on at school to 18, matriculate, go to university, get into the professions, get the confidence that comes from that. And that is mind-blowingly life-changing for the individual, but it is also extravagantly life-changing for the community and for the country in which that happens. Seamus Heaney writes about this in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, we got free second level education a generation earlier. And it was that generation that fueled the civil rights campaign. These new young people who had their degrees, but who had who couldn't get the jobs, but who were articulate and confident and had the confidence that comes from education. But he describes them. He describes what happened in Northern Ireland. He describes Catholics who were second-class citizens as living under high banked clouds of resignation. In other words, they were stoically accepting their lot. And then along came, he describes that suddenly this change of mood. And this change of mood produced people who went into school, stayed on to 18, went into university. And he describes them as having these young bucks now and young girls with a college education, intelligences, brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. Isn't that an extraordinary expression? Crowbars. They were going to use their intellect in the same way that he used his pen, to dig below the surface, to shift the obstacles that were in the way to what? To the full blossoming of human equality, whether it was equality between men and women, equality between gays and straights, equality between black and white, equality. And that's what they were going to do with their education and have been doing with their education. So all our traditions are going to meet that, you know. The Catholic Church is experiencing that. It constantly talks about the great vocational, the rise in vocations in the poorer countries where the education doesn't exist. But in the countries where people are educated, we don't have a cohort of young priests anymore. We have elderly priests who regrettably at the moment with this blessed virus are dying off at an appalling rate. We saw the priests who died, for example, in Bergamo, in large numbers. So we don't, in the Western world, the cradle of Christianity, we do not, and the cradle of the Catholic Church, we do not have the priests who will sustain that type of vocation into the future. And we have to be able to say within our church, you know what, if you keep doing the same thing all the time, and that same thing keeps producing bad outcomes, you're just going to get more and more bad outcomes. But an intelligent people, you know, an educated young cohort of people are going to get fed up with this tediousness, this repetition of bad practice, and they'll walk away. Why? Because they can. And that brings me to the work that I'm doing at the moment. My interest currently, one of the reasons why I did a PhD in a doctorate in canon law was because I really wanted to explore where we are going with young people into the future. Where are we going as the Catholic Church? Where are we going? What are we doing? Because in our system, we've 1.2 billion Catholics, of which somewhere between 300 and 400 million are young people children under the age of 18. Now, they are regarded as members of the Church. Why? Because they were baptized into the Catholic Church. I've often seen it written, including in that film, if you've seen it, Mary Queen of Scots, the most recent film, Mary Queen of Scots.
No, I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it. It has a wonderful young Irish woman in one of the lead roles in it. And well, she's Mary Queen of Scots, obviously, in it. And Saoirse Ronan's her name. And of course, we all trundled along to see it. And it opens with a piece of text on the screen. And the text starts, Mary, Queen of Scots, was born a Catholic. And of course, I'm there with all my family, my husband, my 2 daughters, my 2 sons-in-law, my son, and we're all lined up. And suddenly I see this and I say to my husband, that is theologically absolutely incorrect. That is canonically incorrect. That is absolutely not the case. No one is born a Catholic. And from the far side of the row, my son shouts up, Mum, we're all canonically literate in this row. Would you ever give us peace to watch the film? But what really bothered me was that it perpetuates the myth that you can be born into a faith. Some people are.
You know,
they believe.
This reminds me, if you don't mind, a brief interruption because it's right on point.
Sure.
There is a prophetic saying that a hadith that is very well known in our tradition, which says every child, kullu mauludin, every child is born on a kind of inner disposition of purity, a natural innocence, but it is their parents who make them into one religion or another, which is almost I think echoing exactly what you just said.
Well, what I wanted to try and get to in the work that I'm doing, and I've just written a book on this called Children's Rights and Obligations in Canon Law, and this is the area that I'm now teaching in the University of Glasgow. And what I'm trying to explore is how we become Catholic and what it means to be a member of the church for a child. What does membership of a church mean for a child? Now, this will have ramifications for other religions, but honestly, I have enough to be talking about my own church without getting to, into other churches about which I know very little. But I know a good bit about my own church now. And we say in the Catholic Church, we have a legal system called canon law. It has developed over 2,000 years. It's a very, very intricate very substantive body of written law now gathered into a single unified code. Most of it is in a single unified code. In that code, we say to Catholic parents, before the child is born, prepare for their baptism, because you're responsible for the education, the religious education, and indeed the civic education and guidance of your child, which is absolutely true. You know, obviously family is crucial. Obviously parents are crucial. Parental rights in relation to their children are crucial. I've no argument with that. But in the Catholic Church tradition, we say you bring your child at the earliest opportunity to be baptized. And so we have infant baptism is the norm. Over 90% of our children are baptized shortly after birth. In days gone by, it used to be very shortly after birth. Now it could be, they could be running up the aisle, you know, they could be 2 years old or whatever, but they're still babies. And so, but what happens on that day is two things happen. One is essentially theological, spiritual, if you like, and the other is juridic. One is legal. The spiritual one, you're baptized by the pouring of the water. You become you become incorporated into the body of Christ. And in our tradition, we believe that everybody is born with a form of original sin, and that sin, serious sin, which is original sin, and other forms of serious sin, if you die in a state of sin, you can't go to heaven. Now that's big in our tradition, because we're all trying to get to heaven, apparently. So we want to get rid of sin. We want some way of getting rid of sin. So original sin, which is the sin of Adam and Eve, conferred on all their children since, can only be absolved by baptism. And so we baptize our children, bingo, there it is, and it's gone. Original sin is now gone, and our children can now enter heaven. If God forbid, if they were to die now or to die as babies, they would go straight to heaven. But also, if they die without being baptized, there is no guarantee that they will go to heaven in our tradition. So that frightens the wits out of families. So that's one thing. We're incorporated into the body of Christ, and the doorway to salvation is opened by the ending of original sin. These are spiritual, theological consequences. Let's move now, and they're very nice, and they're grand, and you don't have to actually do anything. But then the second aspect of that is what I'll call the legal or juridic. Because the day you're baptized, you now become a member of the Catholic Church, and you become a member for life, like as in forever. Even if you're excommunicated, even if you excommunicate yourself, even if you join another denomination, doesn't matter. As far as the Catholic canon law is concerned, you are a Catholic for life. And that happened that day. Now, I firmly believe that that has to be reprised. That was our teaching for years. It no longer is consonant with our understanding of people's human rights. People have a right to change religion, and that should be acknowledged by the Catholic Church, which it currently is not. And the second thing is, because the child is now a member of the church, it has obligations as well as rights. It has that many rights, it has that many obligations. And those obligations start to kick in at the age of 7. And so there are big questions about the nature of those obligations. How onerous are they? Is it right to impose them on 7-year-olds who essentially don't really understand them? In the same way, was it right to make them members of a church for life on a day when they were non-compos mentis, when they were babies and hadn't a clue what was going on? So we haven't had that conversation in the Catholic Church. And we need to have it. Why? Because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but even more important than that, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, signed up by every country in the world except one, the United States, and signed up, most importantly of all, by the Catholic Church. The Holy See is a signatory, not just a signatory, but ratified the convention. Not only did it ratify that convention, it was involved in drafting the travaux préparatoires. The idea for the convention came from a wonderful, wonderful Catholic priest, a Belgian Catholic priest, Canon Joe Moorman, wonderful champion of children. And he wanted us, through this convention, to see children as the holders of their own autonomous rights, that they would eventually be able to express their thoughts, their beliefs, their religion, their faith by themselves. Now, parents would have the right to guide them and direct them, to raise them in their faith, but never, ever to impose lifelong obligations of membership. And we haven't really had that debate yet. The
Yeah.
church, it was up for that debate once upon a time, you know. It was up for that debate in 1990, and something has happened since then. It has retreated, regrettably.
Well, you know, these questions you're asking are extremely interesting, and they apply to, I think, other religious traditions equally, and definitely for Islam. There's so many new questions that we confront in our time. So many things have changed, the way we understand the world, the way we understand the human person and human rights, that these traditions need to engage in an internal conversation that's open and fair and intelligent. And it's really inspiring to see you do this. In fact, I pulled up this quote as I was thinking about this. It's from Mark Van Doren's Liberal Education. We read that when I was at Zaytuna College, which is a Muslim liberal arts college in Berkeley. And the founder of that college, one of the co-founders, Hamza Yusuf, he's a convert to Islam, but his name is Mark Hansen. So he's named after Mark Van Doren. And so we read this book, not just for that reason, but I just thought I'd give you the genealogy of how this got into my hands. And this is what it says about tradition. And it reminds me of what you're doing. Tradition is dangerous to the intellect, which does not know how to love it, for it can weigh heavily on weak heads. To accept it is to borrow trouble, for it heaves with controversies and unanswered questions. Then it has a little piece of democracy I'm going to omit and go further. But tradition is most dangerous and most troublesome when it is forgotten. It gives strength as well as takes it. It brings life as well as threatens it. It is life fighting to maintain itself in time. For there is the curious fact that tradition is never so healthy as when it is being fought. We deny its authority, but in doing so, we use its clearest terms and end, if we are original, in enriching it so that it may have strength for future wars. It is orthodoxy at its best, thriving on heresies, which it digests into nobler problems.
Oh, I love that.
It's beautiful. And so, and you know, so the choice that people who belong to a particular tradition they have is, one is to leave it or to, you know, just stop engaging with it. But then there's the other choice of, like what you did, you actually went and studied canon law, and which is a kind of embrace.
Yes.
And now you're interacting with it in ways that it not only requires, but it needs. And so it's just wonderful to see that. And I think we need that conversation.
I think more conversation. And
conversation
that is essentially fueled by love, not by contempt, sometimes by frustration for sure, but ultimately by love. I mean, I look at my church and I love many of its traditions. Some of them I'm not so much in love with, particularly the undiluted masculinity of some of those traditions. But on the other hand, I look at what happens when you tell people, you give them a catechesis from childhood that says, you signed up when you were a baby, or you were signed up, you're now a member, here's what you must believe. There's a big difference between that and saying, here's what we invite you to believe because we think it's wonderful and we hope you'll agree, and you're free to believe or not. That's a very different thing. I think when you tell people you must believe because you were signed up as a baby, the chances are that an educated audience is going to say, actually, I don't have to. You're wrong about that. And if you're wrong about that, couldn't you be wrong about other things too? Other big things, because that's a fairly big thing. And so I think that as I look at young people today in Ireland, for example, many of them with no interest whatsoever in religion, And they have good reason not to be interested in how it's presented and how it has presented itself and how it has dealt. This bad management problem I have talked about, and also some pretty poor doctrine, some pretty poor teaching, particularly around, for example, gay rights or around women's rights. I do think that those debates can be really healthy if they are directed towards an understanding that every child that we baptize and we say as a member of the church has a right to say at some stage, no, I'm not, or yes, I am. And I would prefer if in engaging in a conversation with that child, whether it's as a parent or a grandparent, that we say to them, here's what mom and dad have come to believe. Here's what mom and dad think would be really good for you to understand. And we're going to present it to you. And we're going to raise you in this tradition. And we're going to give you every opportunity to embrace it and love it. But we're going to do that knowing we do not have the right to take your brain, your heart, and your soul and enslave them. We don't want you to be a slave. We want you to be a free person. And we would love, nothing we would love more than when you are 18, 19, 20, that you would come and say to us, yeah, I really like that. I love that tradition. I love that church. I think I'm going to make that church my life. That would be a wonderful thing. That would be a great gift. But it is not a gift that we can expect or insist upon, or worse still, never look for. Why? Because we believe in our right to enslave.
I feel there's a way, the way that you just expressed that is connected in some profound manner to the theme of building bridges that we began with.
Correct.
That this kind of worldview or sentiment or theology is something that is at the foundation of what it will take for others, people of different peoples, to live together in peace. And it's, I think, this deep introspection of our own traditions that is in some ways inspired by, or that in turn inspires the way that we look at others as well, as part of the same family. So I think it's hard to leave on a more profound note. Maybe I'll say in closing, just on what you were talking about with when you had the conversation about Mary in Islam, and Mary, your name is Mary.
Yes. Called after that, Mary.
No, yeah, and then in the Muslim tradition, lots of Maryam is a common name.
Yes, beautiful name.
I had a Quran teacher once who named 3 of his daughters Maryam with a different second name, just to distinguish them, because he loved the name so much. And one of the reasons he did this, he loved the Quran. And Mary is the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran. And I like to say I'm at Notre Dame, and it's the University of Mary, so I feel very much at home.
Yes.
For that reason. And there's an interesting coincidence that the statue of Mary on the dome is
I know it well.
Is 19 feet tall, and the chapter in the Quran that is entitled after Mary is chapter 19.
No way, really?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, like I say, the Lord works in mysterious ways to draw our attention to what we share.
So I love that coincidence. And one of the things that you said, and I've been thinking about in this conversation, is how 5/7 of the people of the world are religious of one form or another, and yet religion isn't present in some of the most important rooms and most important places, most important conversations. And also when it is mentioned, it's negative. And even in our histories, when we look back, somehow we tend to highlight just the events that are negative, that will incite hatred and enmity. But there's so many beautiful episodes in our history as well. I think what you've done in Ireland is one of those episodes, if it can be remembered, from Good Friday to the choreography of the angels. Going back to the early Muslim tradition, I'll just end with this. You know, the first encounter with Christians and Muslims, one of the first encounters, was when Muslims were being persecuted in Mecca. And so the Prophet Muhammad sent them to seek refuge in Africa, across the Red Sea, in Abyssinia. It was an Ethiopian kingdom. And the Prophet said, there's a righteous king there, a Christian king, and he'll give you refuge. And so they went there and they got refuge. And then they were chased down by the Meccans who were persecuting them, asking for them back. And so the king then brought them before him and asked each of them to make their case. And one of the things that the Meccans were saying was they speak ill of Jesus. And so he asked them to say, what do you say about Jesus? So they recited from this chapter of Mary, chapter 19. And he heard this recitation, and he says, he drew a line in the sand. He said, the difference between us and you is no thicker than this line, and you have refuge. And so these are beautiful stories. And just talking to you reminded me of them. Thank you so much.